Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful.
وعد الله لا يخلف الله وعده ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون.
It is a promise of Allah. Allah faileth not His promise, but most of mankind know not.
يعلمون ظاهرا من الحياة الدنيا وهم عن الآخرة هم غافلون.
They know only some appearance of the life of the world and are heedless of the hereafter.
والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. صدق الله. Sadaqallah Azim. My dear respected brothers, elders, learned scholars, sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If one takes into account the discussion or the discourse, the importance of da'wah to non-Muslims and our failings, particularly in modern day times and indeed in history, there are certain practical examples that we can take into account or view specifically in the context of getting information out to the masses. If one looks at a practical example, in 1933, in Germany, a week before the general elections, you find that the strategically timed, what was then called Reichstag fire, that was the home of the German parliament, took place and was subsequently blamed on communists through an elaborate mechanism and means of vicious propaganda, creating a consensus in the minds of the masses, using tools of writing, using the tools of the medium of the radio, and of course using the tools in terms of public communications in the sense of mass rallies that were heard. And what happened after the fire took place, they subsequently blamed this on the communists. President Paul von Hindenburg's emergency decree subsequently followed. And as a result of that, the civil liberties were suspended, the Weimar Republic democracy ended, and you find that Hitler and the Nazi Party assumed power, and the fascist powers were basically enough for them to basically take over the Europe and indeed much of Eastern Europe subsequently. You find further examples. On the 7th of December 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he manipulated Japan to attack Pearl Harbor and subsequently giving him the opportunity to enter into a war which he had wanted initially from the early 1930s, but had to convince the pacifist public that it was necessary to do so. Initially, he had told the people, mothers of America, your children will not go to war. But subsequently, the advent of Pearl Harbor took place, and through an elaborate means of propaganda, they created a mass consensus using the tools available to them, and subsequently, the United States entered into the Second World War. Now, what we find from these two examples, and there are hundreds of like-minded examples, is that people in power, be it in the political establishment, be it in the religious establishment, be it in the academic establishment, have the mechanisms and the means and indeed the tools and use it to the ultimate level in terms of getting certain information out to the public. Howsoever false, howsoever corrupt, howsoever manipulative that information is, they have the means and the mechanisms of getting this out to the public. And unfortunately, we as Muslims have, in a sense, failed in terms of our initial injunctions, as you would find in different passages of the Quran and various permutations of the Prophet himself, enjoining us not only to create an Iqra community, a reading community, a community that is educated, but a community that delivers a message to different ends of the earth. We have retrogressed in the sense of becoming a La Iqra community. I was having a chat with one of your leading members yesterday, and the consensus or the suggestions were made, which is in fact a consensus throughout much of South Africa and indeed many parts of the world, that there is a level of confusion, even in terms of terminology, in terms of usage of terminology, where sometimes people confuse da'wah with islah or with reformation. So in a sense, people believe that they're engaging in da'wah when in actual fact, the methodology of communication or the method or the level of discourse is somewhat insular or somewhat leaning or adjoined or necessitated by its very nature, targeting a particular group or a particular audience. In other words, we are retrogressive in the sense of inwardly looking as opposed to outwardly looking. We haven't created a discourse in terms of which we can get information across to the masses, and in terms of unpacking the basic spirit of what Islam means, certainly to us as Muslims, and indeed in the context of the 21st century. If you take into account the whole notion of haqq, truth, that truth per se is one and cannot be two-sided, then consequently the emotive faith, which is your iman, which is based on emotion and religion, and your cognitive faith, which is your iman, which is based on reason, are basically supposed to be united in a single organic whole. And so there should be no conflict between faith, between iman, and there should be no conflict between reason, between ilm, between knowledge. So not just is the acquisition of knowledge the duty of every Muslim man and woman, but also once you acquire that knowledge, it enjoins upon you the obligation to in fact spread that information to different communities, different tribes, and different backgrounds. If one has to look, for example, at the verse of the Quran in Surah Al Imran chapter 3 verse 103, which is quoted quite often, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold fast per se to the bond of unity or to the rope which Allah has created in the ummah, and do not divide yourselves into sects or into any groups on any grounds whatsoever. And when you take that particular command, laying in conjunction with the whole idea of Muslim unity, and bearing in mind that historically speaking, when unity was in fact reached, when it was the epoch, you find that society flourished, information flourished, people communicated the message of Islam, da'wah, if what you call da'wah, it permeated society at large. But unfortunately, when you find division, and each and every single group regards itself as being on the sole right path, then you find that not only does retrogression take place, but you basically fall into your own idea of self-destruction. Now, in respect of that, in Surah Azab, chapter 30, verse 32, the Quran says, مِنَ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. It says, from amongst them, who divide themselves on their petty religious issues, to paraphrase the Quranic, and divide themselves into mutually hostile groupings. And each and every single grouping regards itself as being on the right path alone, and every other group as absolutely contemptible. In other words, every other group which is basically kafir, which doesn't agree with you, you label them. It becomes far more easier to label them. Only you in your narrow grouping are absolutely right, everybody else is wrong, nobody knows what they're doing, as a result of which we form artificial constructs. Constructs that are erected, that are artificially constructed amongst ourselves, and so in doing so, the very element of da'wah falls, the information that you can get out to the masses falls away. For example, you find a particular passage, Ya Ahl al-Kitab, لا تغلوا في دينكم أو يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم ألا نعبد إلا الله ولا نشرك به شيئا ولا يتخذ بعضنا بعضا أربابا من دون الله. The message or the exhortation in those passages are to who? Not to Muslims, not to people who are so-called mu'mins. Ya Ahl al-Kitab, O people of the book, Oh humanity, Ya ayyuhan nas, not Ya ayyuhal Muslim. So the point is that if you have a book which is universalist in its nature, it speaks to the masses, it's not a Muslim religious book, then what does it behove upon us as individual human beings and as Muslims, men, women, what does it behove us to do? Do we sit upon it and just keep it for ourselves? Or do we basically impart the universal message to humanity at large? What's our role? What's our purpose? Why is it that today we have become succumbed to elements of propaganda in the mass media? Whereas we should in fact be the leaders in terms of information, the leaders in terms of education, the leaders in terms of dissemination of information. Why is it that illiteracy is highest amongst Muslim countries? Why is it that education is so low? Why is it that not a single Muslim university is on any of the top 100 universities of the world? Not one. Yet even if you look at the idea and the concept of the university per se, when was the first? The idea, the concept? Education. It was an Islamic idea. Yet when it comes to literacy, when it comes to education, when it comes to knowledge, we are at the lower ends, the lower ebbs of society. So again the warning goes on in Surah Al-Imran chapter 3 verse 105. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ تَفَرَّقُوا وَاخْتَلَفُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْبَيِّنَاتُ وَأُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. It says, the warning goes, do not become like those of the previous ummahs. Do not become like those of previous nations who divided themselves again on petty religious issues and turned themselves into sects. For indeed, that is a grave chastisement. In fact, in another passage of the Quran, it compares that quality as tantamount to being shirk. And we are told that the only thing that Allah will not pardon on the Day of Judgment is shirk. And here you find an analogy being drawn in terms of what you find. So if we bear into account that, number one, if the principle of unity is an established fact of Islam and the Islamic way of life, and you have to consider the values and the social norms of Islam where this unity has been established, the fundamental norms of the Islamic value system of social order: unity, justice, selfless service to others, and of course the idea of da'wah, conveying the message. Udu ila sabili rabbika bil hikmah wal mau'izati al hasanati wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan. Invite all to the ways of thy Lord with wisdom and with beautiful preaching, and reason with them in the ways that are best and most gracious. A common phrase, a common verse. We hear this all the time. It becomes exceptionally boring to hear it. But how do we internalize it? How do we interpret it? Again, people understand it in a limited sense. Calling Muslims, for example, to the mosque is viewed as da'wah. But that's not the understanding that you find from the Quranic point of view. The Quranic point of view is universalist in its approach. It's incorrect when we think or put ourselves in artificial, shallow constructs and say, we are Muslims, our religion is Islam, and our holy book is the Quran. It's a Muslim religious book. It's false. The Quran is not a Muslim religious book. The Quran is not a Muslim holy book. The Quran is a book of guidance for humanity at large. And how do we make it a book of guidance for humanity if we keep it up on our shelves or just basically imbibe in forms of religious incantations? Even the level of education. That's why psychologically many of us have been indoctrinated and brainwashed. In other words, we can become good reciters, powerful reciters, more better reciters than Arabs or than Egyptian qaris, some of us. With humble apologies to our imams. We can recite Arabic in the same manner that you'd find an Englishman reciting English. But the analogy there is, if one were to basically be able to read Shakespearean English in all its, with all its pronunciation, with all its appropriate grammar, and you can't understand a single word of the English that you're reciting, what do you say of such a person? He can recite English better than the Queen herself. He can recite English better than King George. But in his recitation, he doesn't know what he's reading. What would you say of such an individual? But many of us Muslims, unfortunately, not necessarily as a fault of our own, but because of the educational system, end up becoming pure rote learners, good reciters, good memorizers, but not understanding a single word. With the result of which the message which is a fundamental and foremost message, cannot be communicated. Forget being communicated to the masses, we can't communicate it to ourselves because we don't know what the book entails. We don't know the parables of the Quran. We don't know the message. We don't know the universal exhortations. None of it is familiar to us. So if we don't know it ourselves, how can we convey it to others? So, flowing from that, you'd find, therefore, that one of the key factors Islam lays on, or lays its stress upon, is the concept or the idea of justice and selfless service to others. Because if you can show that as a community, you can become involved in society, in uplifting society, in reshaping society, then people will take you seriously. Because you are getting involved in uplifting society and you are saying, look, here's an alternative to the liberal secularist enterprise, an alternative to the capitalist enterprise. This is the alternative that you present. These are the solutions that you propound, and this is a way forward. That in itself is a form of dawah, because you are not just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. Some of us talk left and walk right, but you're engaging in both. Therefore, you'd find in Surah Nisa, verse 135, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada lillah. Stand up for that which is right, that which is just in everything, and indeed in every dimension of life. Stand up for justice, not just for the sake of expediency, not just for the sake of personal benefit or for personal motive, but purely for the sake of Allah. And in doing so, people will then basically say that this man is just not just simply talking. He's engaging in really shaping society. He's engaging in uplifting society. When we do anything for the sake of Allah, be it preaching, be it communicating His message, as the Prophet would say, "Ballighu anni walau aya," convey the message, even if it is just one word. One word, you convey the message. When you do anything for the sake of Allah, then by implication, the nafs, or the ego, is per se annihilated. And as a result of the annihilation, all the sentiments will be placed before you on the day of judgment. Even if it goes against your next of kin, even if it goes against your parents, even if it goes against your family, etc. Otherwise, by simply offering prayers, by simply reciting the tasbih, which are noble deeds, without the actual action, that in itself will not lead to taqwa. Again, you'd find in Surah Ma'idah, verse 8, we are told that, O believers, O people who have accepted Iman, should it happen that there are groups or other groups amongst you who are hostile to you or towards your religion, and you are dealing with them, you should deal with them appropriately, you should deal with them justly, in spite of the injustice from their side, and in fact convey the truth to them. So your duty and obligation is not just to simply convey the message. Be just in your dealings with them. That's a principle of justice which will support unity. Why does disunity come into the community? Disunity comes to the community by and large because fundamentally there is a clash of egos. And when there's a clash of egos, when these individual egos are projected out there in the form of committees, in the form of trusts, in the form of organizations, whatever the case is, the method of dawah cannot be satisfied. Justice cannot be satisfied. When the individual egos are projected, you find that the annihilation of the ego, the submersion of the ego into the divine pleasure or the absolute nafs of Allah, if it starts from the point and then gives a principle of justice in clear terms, if you not reach that, then effectively we have failed in terms of our dealings with society, in terms of our dealings with our own fellow human beings. Greed is another cause of disunity. Another point you'd find in Surah 90 when the Quran raises a question, it says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ. What do you understand about the most difficult and about the most rewarding of virtues? And it says, فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. It is the abolishment of any form of enslavement or the feeding in the times of stress or famine, etc., etc. Now, aqaba means walking the steep path. Then we are told that the most important virtue is the abolishment of slavery, any form of enslavement from the world, which could also mean abolishment of social injustice. Who is doing that in the world today? Organizations like World Vision, organizations like the Wycliffe Bible Translation, the Summer Institute of Linguistics. They are going to parts of the third world, and what they are doing, they are combining their own method of missionary work, and they're combining it together with feeding schemes, with development aids, not just feeding schemes, with development, with alternatives. Not only that, over the past 2 decades, and of course now it's pretty stale, they've developed something which is called contextualization. Contextualization is what? It's an idea where you come to a community and you see a community which is soaked into its culture. It's soaked into its culture so deeply that it's difficult to take the culture out of them. And so what they do, that for example build up mosques, beautiful mosques. But those mosques or the masajids will not be masjids, they will be churches. Churches in disguise of mosques. So people will come, there'll be a member, there'll be your musalla, there'll be everything. People will even come and wear the kurta. Your priest will come with the kurta. But the sermon will effectively be a Christian service. These will be Christians ministering to the people. And effectively, they engage in upliftment schemes, social development schemes, and the hearts and the minds of the masses are won over. They won over completely. We are not even at that level because we haven't even created the level of discourse in our community. We haven't educated ourselves with the tools for the purposes of propagating our message. We haven't internalized the message of the Quran because many of us have not delved into the text. We can't understand Arabic as a language. One example in terms of where Muslim civilization flourished, and I know time's at a premium, I'll have to obviously close it shortly, but there was one example, a good example during the time of the Abbasids, during one of the Maghazi battles, where during the battles between Muslims and the Kuffar, you find several Muslims were wounded in battle. And so a dying soldier screamed out, and he basically said, "I'm thirsty, I'm dying." So a water carrier comes and he rushes to him. And as he comes to the dying man, another voice is heard in the distance. And that person says, "I'm dying, I'm thirsty, I need water." So the dying person